Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. So this is a presentation that I gave at the SciTech 2024 conference on the history of the word Burble. Now, I should start this off by saying our group, we're not, we're not historians, we're not linguists, and so this paper was a little bit outside of our expertise. But we enjoyed writing it, and so I hope you'll enjoy listening in. So there's a lot of important things that are connected to a word and its meaning. So the connotation, what comes to mind when you think of a word, the history of that word, when it started being used, maybe when it stopped being used in one or other contexts. And so these things can change over time. Words are very dynamic in language. So just think for a moment how words such as browsing or social distancing or even the phrase mask up, how those things have changed over time. Browsing since the introduction of the internet and social distancing and mask up since the COVID pandemic. All these things that didn't used to exist or perhaps they were existed in a different facet and now they've changed. So another example is the word fluxion. So the word fluxion was the term that Newton originally used in his Principia for what we today call a derivative. And then specifically in aerodynamics, back 100 years ago, people used the term resistance for drag and angle of incidence for angle of attack. And so we're just adding Burble to this collection of words that have changed over time. Burble being a word that was used in aerodynamics but is no longer used in the current study of aerodynamics. So, this is the whole premise of the paper. We wanted to look at how the word Burble changed over time. We first noticed it in a book and we thought, what in the world is Burble? And so that kind of spun into what this work is. So there were six specific uses of the term Burble, and I'm going to walk through them semi-chronologically, and then we'll get into a little bit of the change in the meaning, as well as other things we can learn from the word. So what is Burble? Well, Burble was originally used in the 1300s to mean eddying flow in liquids or gases. In the 1900s, it was applied to aerodynamics and used to mean flow which separates from a lifting surface. Now, when they would bring up this word, they would frequently mention, oh, by the way, the word Burble, it has to do with eddying flow, but it also means confusion, or they would say it has a root meaning in disorder. And so I want to stress that a little bit right here. We dig into this a little bit more in the paper, and so for sake of time, I'm not going to go into more detail. Um, but the word burble has a little bit of a root in confusion. So the first use of the term burble was with the Burble point. And so what is the Burble point? Well, the critical angle of the wing has been appropriately called the Burble point due to the change of the airflow from regular to eddying. So this is one of the first digitized uses of the term Burble, and here's a figure you can see there as we change this airfoil and increase an angle of attack, we start to get this eddying flow off the back of the wing, this flow separation. And so they first noticed these things when they would take up their biplanes and they would fly and they would notice, oh, if I had my wings in such and such a manner, it would have better Burble characteristics, is what they would call it, or than another. So different staggering the wings or different mounting angles between the two wings, etc. But it was very difficult to quantify the relationship of stall, and so this Burble relationship. And so what they first did was to look at, well, let's study airfoils and propellers and study Burble on a simpler geometry. And so they did that. Now, something interesting at this point was, Burble was introduced 1900s. By the 1930s, so late 1920s, early 1930s, people were unsure where this word even came from. In fact, in the literature, there were a couple interesting comments that would say something along the lines of the so-called Burble point, to use a technical term that has been borrowed from the Jabberwock. Now, if you don't know what the Jabberwock is, the Jabberwock is a fictional creature that's mentioned in a poem given in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, and it says, "The Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood and burbled as it came." And Levy wasn't the only one to notice this. There were a couple others who made this connection. Now, the purpose of this paper is not to decide whether or not it came from the Jabberwock. But it was interesting that within 20 years, no one even knew who used the word first. No one even knew where the word came from or why it was applied to aerodynamics in the first place. And I think that's a key uh, characteristic of the term burble is no one even knew who used it first, and so there wasn't much of a genealogy, if that makes any sense, for the use of the term burble. So as we mentioned, they started studying them on airfoils and propellers, and it moved into more of a study of interaction between surfaces. So flow separating off of one object or another, or the joined surfaces, and they called this interference burble. So flow separation caused by joined aircraft surfaces. And they started noticing, well, there can be benefits to creating burble. And so they developed what we today call spoilers, as well as looking at ways to mitigate burble through the use of leading edge slats. So the front part moves forward into the flow and it helps keep the flow attached to the airfoil a little bit longer. So this was a little bit later. So we started with the Burble Point, then they moved to looking at the full aircraft connection of lifting surfaces. And as aircraft began to improve, performance improved, faster, better engines, airplanes could fly faster. They noticed that there was this point at which the flow was compressible. And in his seminal work, John Stack called the flow that separates after a compression shock the compressibility burble. He says the compressibility burble is due to the conversion of kinetic energy into heat at the compression shock. And there's a couple Schlieren photographs from that work showing before and when the wing is experiencing this compressibility burble, you can see the shock on the trailing edge of that airfoil. And they began to theorize things like, well, this could be a real problem for a diving aircraft. And in fact, Stack and von Doenhoff theorized Mach tuck, which later obviously became a problem with a couple aircraft in World War II. And then, excuse me, and then they also were taking a look at changing the design on aircraft geometry to improve compressibility burble characteristics. So changing the noses, changing engine cowlings and such. For example, one researcher noted that, we're not going to be able to do these round noses on airplanes anymore. We're probably going to have to go to something a little bit more sharp, or like a cone. So it was at this point they started noticing once again, oh, hey, there could be a benefit to creating this burble on an aircraft or any flying object. And that led to the development of burble fences. So you can see this aerodynamics decelerator, a drawing of that shown here. And this toroidal structure, so a burble fence is a toroidal structure used to induce uniform flow. This toroidal structure on the outside of this aerodynamic decelerator could be used to improve stability of whatever was flying, aircraft, missile, spacecraft, in subsonic and transonic regimes. And so there was a lot of research that went into how do we inflate these burble fences? How do we change the design to improve these burble fences and such? And so there was quite a bit of research that went into looking at changing these burble fences and improving the design. So this word still is in use today. Something I should mention though is frequently with this and with the other words that when they introduce it, they frequently put in quotation marks and there's a couple reasons for that, but one I'll talk about right here is to introduce a term that may not be familiar to the reader. So in this case, burble is a word that isn't really used in the study of aerodynamics, but it was used quite a while ago. And we go into more of that in the paper, and so you can check that out if you're interested. So the next use was the study um, of what they called the burble noise, which was the noise caused by interaction of the main rotor tip vortices with the tail rotor. And so you can see a drawing of that here. So the weight coming off the main rotor of a helicopter would interact with the tail rotor, particularly in forward flight. And they noticed that it was because they were spinning the tail rotor up and forward instead of the other direction. and this would cause a burble noise to be directed downward. And there was quite a bit of research that went into mitigating this noise. It was particularly detrimental to the pilot. It was a really annoying noise. And so there was quite a bit of several different things they could do, changing the geometry and such, but they noticed that the easiest solution was just to flip the direction of that tail rotor, and it would direct the noise upward, and they wouldn't have to deal with that noise being generated. So if you look down at the bottom, the time scale, this word was introduced, and then it was gently used a little bit, but it pretty well died off within about 5-10 years. And so now we're getting to the very last use of the term burble in aerodynamics, and that's to describe what has been called the burble. And so this is the air wake behind an aircraft carrier, and so you can see a little graphic of an aircraft flying through this burble. And one of the greatest ironies is particularly in recent literature. Not only do they put burble in quotation marks, noting it's an unused term, but they'll also say it comes from the aviation community. And the irony there is, this word originally came from aerodynamicists, but the truth being that those original aerodynamicists were also part-time pilots, and so there is truth to their statement. Um, so as you can see, it's a period of downwash followed by offwash that doubles in size about two ship lengths aft of the aircraft carrier. And it's been particularly noted to affect the last 10 seconds of handling. And so you can see something like that with this airplane flying. And it can particularly affect the handling qualities of the aircraft. Um, and so frequently what's done is to study an analysis or to analyze a design. They will build simulations to implement this burble in an aircraft simulation or helicopter landing simulation so that they can test designs, control laws, etc., due to uh, interaction with this burble. And this word still is in use today, but once again, it's not as frequently used. Generally, it's used in other communities, such as Navy pilots, but they don't use it in an aerodynamics uh, context. So we've talked a little bit about the history of the word. Um, so first, maybe we should ask the question, did the word burble fall out of use? And the answer is, well, let's take a look at the data. So shown here is a plot of the Google Ngrams of word use divided by annual words published. So you can see that 1e to the -7 up there. That's just because there's so many words published, and they've noted that this is the best way to represent this data. And you'll see in the orange curve that we have the word burble, and in green, the term flow separation. And that's the term that has more or less replaced burble and burble point. And you'll notice that right around the 40s and 50s, this word change shifted, and they no longer use the term burble. They started using the term flow separation. And so why did it die off? Well, first, as we mentioned, it was a provisional descriptor. It was put in quotation marks, and they said, you know what, we'll fill this in later. And the second, and some of you may have noticed this already, was this large spike in orange, and we'll get to this in a second, why the heck that the data does that. The second reason for the decline was because there were other words that could be used to describe burble, the phenomenon of burble, without using the term burble. So, like we mentioned with that plot, why in their world was there this big spike in burble if we don't use the word burble in aerodynamics? Well, burble isn't only used in aerodynamics. Shown here are the plots of burble compared with different words that are used outside of aerodynamics with the term burble. For example, babble, bubble, gurgle. And these words are used in a similar context, and you'll note particularly that gurgle has almost the exact same trend as burble. So this is a slightly different normalized plot. This is the word use divided by the 2019 word use. And so you can see that it follows this very same trend that the use of the word burble has increased, but outside of aerodynamics, not inside of aerodynamic theory. And we can check this once again by looking at the Google digitized works. Anything printed, or excuse me, published and digitized before 1990, there's about an 80% chance that you're going to come across one that's about aerodynamics, that uses the term burble, that's about aerodynamics. But after 1990, there's only about a 10% of those works are aerodynamic in nature, these works that use the term burble. So there's a couple things we can learn from the use of the term burble. So semantics deals with the study of the use of words, the meaning of words and how those may change over time. And there's various different ways to analyze a word. So one way that has been used is called Keith prototype semantics, and that is given a description, what comes to your mind first. So for example, if I were to say to you, think of an animal that has orange and black and white stripes, well, you'd probably think of a tiger, right? But why didn't a monarch butterfly come to mind, or why didn't a clownfish come to mind? These are all animals with orange and black and white stripes. It's just dependent on what fits this checklist in your mind. Do you hear orange and black and white stripes, and you probably think tiger. And the same thing happened with Burble. People began to describe this eddying flow off a lifting surface, and people no longer thought, oh, that's Burble. They would think, oh, that's flow separation. One second way of analyzing is through Putnam's stereotype semantics. And so this has to do with kind of the opposite. If you're given a term, what description comes to your mind first? So, for example, if I were to say, think of a tiger, you'd probably think of an orange and a black and a white tiger. You probably wouldn't think of a white and black tiger, and you probably wouldn't think of a tiger shark. Yeah, those animals still fit the checklist. They just didn't fit the checklist that was in your brain for that term. And the same thing once again happened with Burble. When people would say, oh, Burble, aerodynamic flow separation was not what came to mind first. They would think of gurgle and those other terms that we've talked about. In fact, the correlation between Burble and gurgle was particularly noted by one researcher, that those two words, because they have a similar meaning and a similar final synonym, they are used very frequently together, Burble and gurgle, etc. And you can check more about that in the paper. There were a couple other semantics analyses we performed there. So what can we learn from the word burble? Have we gained anything? And I believe we have, and that's specificity. And you can look at more stuff in the paper if you're interested. But we've gained this specificity that when we say burble, we mean, or excuse me, when we when we talk about flow separation, it's a lot easier to understand what the phenomenon, the concept being discussed, if we call it flow separation rather than if we call it burble. And the inverse of that question is what has been lost. And there are a couple things that I think we've lost, but I think the most important is kind of a whimsical, romantic, shared experience of discovery. So these guys, these people, these aerodynamics researchers that studied this 100 years ago, they were very unfamiliar. They were butting up against the unknown, and they didn't know what this phenomenon one was. And so they used a term that was slightly related to the unknown, slightly related to this confusion, and that was the term burble. So we've talked about how words can have a powerful impact not only on their meaning but on their usage over time. And we've talked about the history of the word burble, which is the history of an interim word, a word that was a provisional descriptor. People used it and then they put in quotation marks and then they dropped it. It was also the history of a word that wasn't very specific. It was a word that was lacking the specificity we would want in an engineering vocabulary. And Burble was also the study of the unknown. It was studying a phenomenon that we did not yet understand. And I put forward that it's the history of discovery. And so I think that's something we can learn from the word burble is that there's a lot of shared experience that we can have with these original aerodynamicists, these original researchers, that they didn't know what they were studying, or they were studying what was unfamiliar to them, and they were butting against this unknown, and we're in a similar situation, and we can do similar things. Thank you for listening. I appreciate your attention, and if you have any questions, shoot them in the comments. Thank you.